Europa Universalis V, the successor to my favorite game of all time, finally has a release date. It will come out on November 4th of this year. Alongside the date, Paradox has added an early hardware requirements section to the Steam page, which has triggered a lot of discussion online about what to expect in regards to the game's performance. In this video, I want to look at the additional context added to these requirements by Paradox staff in a thread on the Paradox forums. And I also want to go over what PC parts are near in performance to the ones listed in the game requirements, so you can better understand how your system might perform if you don't stay on top of the convoluted PC hardware product space. Paradox has not tested laptops yet, but I'll make an estimation on them as well. I've seen some people online quite concerned about how much higher the requirements are compared to the other Paradox games that have been released in the Gemini version of their game engine. These being Imperator Rome, Crusader Kings 3, and Victoria 3. My opinion is that whatever they were targeting as recommended performance in these games before was much too optimistic and didn't reflect the hardware required to have a good experience playing into the late or end game. Crusader Kings 3 and Victoria 3 in particular slow down a lot towards the end of a campaign, although performance is much better today in 2025 than when either of these released. Since the initial posting of the hardware requirements, Paradox staff have clarified what the minimum and recommended system requirements are targeted at achieving, and a little about how they tested for it. Explained in a thread titled Regarding Hardware Requirements on the forum, minimum requirements is aimed at 30 frames per second 1080p resolution with the game at low quality preset. Recommended requirements is aimed at 60 frames per second 2160p resolution with the game at ultra quality settings. The stage of the game being tested was also further clarified in the replies. Performance was measured at game speed 5, the fastest of the 5 speed settings in-game that control how quickly the clock advances. And crucially in my opinion, they test both on game start, which is 1337, and using a save around 400 years into the game in the 1700s. Theoretically, this means they are portraying a fairly accurate hardware requirements picture, potentially more so than the games I mentioned earlier, which have much lower requirements on the surface. This does leave out one key area that affects whether a game feels performant in my opinion. This is how quickly time advances on speed 5 and whether there are excessive freezes between months or years. For example, in Victoria 3 with an older processor, you could have an acceptable amount of frames per second and graphical quality, but the game takes 10 minutes to advance through 1 year of game time on speed 5, and when each month ticks over, your game might freeze for many seconds. Whereas if you had a more recent processor, the game can advance through a year in under 2 minutes with minimal hitching. All of this to say that how quickly a processor can calculate and advance the in-game time is a key metric to test for in my opinion. Unexpectedly, Paradox staff did respond to someone asking for exactly this kind of information on the forums. In addition to stating several times that they plan to release more granular information regarding game performance on different hardware, they also might include information on recent laptop performance and the aforementioned game speed differences. While I was making this video, they actually released information on the game speed. At minimum spec, a year takes 100 seconds at the beginning of the game. At recommended spec, it takes 35 seconds. In other words, a 65% reduction time from the 8700K to the 14700K, or just under 3 times faster. Additionally, a Paradox staff member said that across the 500 years of game time, the tick speed only gets about 1/3 slower. This is better than Victoria 3 in my experience, which currently gets about 50% slower by 1900, still 36 years before the end date. The Victoria 3 performance difference being my own testing with an AMD 3900X as well as a 9950X. This makes me very optimistic about the game's performance on launch, although I can't come to any definitive conclusions until I have the game myself. Before I get into the requirements themselves and what hardware is similar, I'll quickly mention some of the other things I saw mentioned in the hardware requirement thread. GPU VRAM is apparently the most important factor when it comes to graphics card minimum requirements. Using a card with under 6 GB of VRAM may cause out-of-memory crashes, and is not going to be supported, with the game possibly using up to between 12 and 16 GB of VRAM if you have it available. The user interface and user experience have apparently been designed around 2160p resolution since the beginning of development. It can scale down to 1440p and 1080p and supports ultra-wide resolutions as well. But resolutions below 1080p are not being tested and are not guaranteed to work properly. EU5 does currently have a basic implementation of DLSS though. It is confirmed that it is not being used for performance measurements as well. The game is only being released on Windows at launch, with the door open for other operating systems in the future, but they don't seem to be working on other versions at this time. It also has not been tested on ARM-based processors such as the Snapdragon laptops, so they are not currently supported. It will be available on GeForce Now at launch. Finally, the size of the game is currently 20 gigabytes, but it is not finalized and may change before launch. Now let's get into the specs themselves. I am a hardware enthusiast, but I am not a professional in the industry, and I don't have any experience testing the parts myself that I don't actively use in my own computer. These are my best estimations based on all the data I enjoy reading about from various hardware news outlets. Minimum specs, which I'll remind you is supposed to be playing at 1080p 30fps low settings, is an i7-8700K or Ryzen 5 3600 processor, 16GB of RAM, and a 1066GB or RX 580 graphics card. For processor, this essentially means that any desktop processor from 2019 or newer that has at least 6 cores meets the minimum requirements. Anything with 6 cores or more from the AMD 3000, 5000, 7000, or 9000 series processors. For Intel, anything with 6 cores or more from the 8000, 9000, 10000, 11000, 12000, 13000, 14000, or Ultra 200 series processors. Intel's gone a little crazy with processor releases. From what I've read about the various laptop processors, the minimum requirements for gaming laptops should be around an AMD Ryzen 7 4700H or an Intel i7 10850H. These are both 6-core laptop processors from 2020. This essentially means any gaming laptop from late 2020 onwards with at least 6 cores will meet or exceed the minimum spec. The two graphics cards they list for minimum are the GTX 1060 6GB and the RX 580. This means essentially any graphics card with at least 6GB of VRAM released in 2017 onward will meet the minimum requirements, with a few exceptions for very low-end parts, such as the Intel A380, which might be below minimum. The high-end cards from 2016, such as the 1070, 1080, and so on, are also above the minimum, of course. AMD generations after the 580 would be RX Vega 5000, 6000, 7000, and 9000 series. NVIDIA generations after the 1060 would be RTX 2000, 3000, 4000, and 5000. For Intel cards, the A580 is theoretically the first one above minimum spec, but Paradox hasn't mentioned Intel graphics cards, and their performance in other games is highly dependent on the graphics card drivers that Intel puts out. We won't really know if the Intel cards will perform as expected until the game releases, or Paradox mentions them directly. Laptop GPU performance is dependent on cooling, but gaming laptops with adequate cooling should place the minimum requirements around a 1070 Max-Q or a 2060 Max-Q for NVIDIA. Max-Q being the slightly weaker version of NVIDIA's mobile GPUs, the 2060 mobile being slightly stronger than the Max-Q version of the same card, for example. On the AMD side, this would be a 5600M or better. Similar to laptop processors, basically any gaming laptop GPU from late 2020 onwards that has at least 6GB of VRAM will meet the minimum requirements. Moving on to the recommended specs, I'll remind you that they are supposed to be aimed at 2160p 60fps ultra settings. They're stated to be an i7 14700K or a Ryzen 7 7800X3D, 32GB of RAM, and an RTX 3060 Ti or RX 6700 XT. For processor, what they have chosen is interesting. The 7800X3D and 14700K are not equivalent processors in all applications, which leads me to believe that the AMD processors with 3D cache will be pulling above their weight at EU5. This is interesting because benchmarks for older Clausewitz engine games, such as Stellaris, see large benefits from the X3D processors, while the disparate user testing for Victoria 3 seems to indicate that 3D cache doesn't make as much of a difference in that game. I would peg the 14700K equivalent non-X3D processor for AMD as the 9900X. The other processors around or above the recommended specs in my opinion would be the 13900K, 14900K, 265K, and 285K for Intel. The 7950X, 9900X, 9800X3D, and 9950X for AMD. Essentially all of the high-end 12-core plus processors from 2022 onwards. It is likely that the 8-core processors from these generations perform almost as well, if not as well, such as the 9700X, but I don't have access to the game to test this out myself. The other Gemini engine games can make use of a lot of processor cores. CK3 uses up to 8 cores as far as I can tell, while Victoria 3 uses all 16 cores of my current processor. An interesting piece of data to note, the content creator Redhawk recently posted a video where he tested the time it takes to play 1 year of EU5 with an 11700K processor. The time was closer to the recommended spec tick speed than the minimum one, and the 100 seconds stated for a year to go by at the minimum spec already doesn't sound too bad to me. My guess is that any desktop processor generation from 2022 onwards is going to perform well enough that you are not thinking about it when playing the game. Looking at laptop processors, they are likely all going to be at least 15% slower than their desktop counterparts, and laptop performance is always highly dependent on how good the cooling for that particular laptop is. Considering that X3D chips seem likely to do well, the AMD 7945HX3D and 9955HX3D processors are top contenders to hit the recommended spec. The other high-end laptop processors are likely to fall a bit short of the recommended spec, but I don't expect it to be by very much. All of the higher-end gaming laptop processors from the last 2 or 3 years are very good compared to the laptops of previous years. The names are all quite confusing and I don't think it is worth listing them all, but my estimation would be that all of the high-end processors with 12 cores or more will be close, depending on how good the laptop cooling is. This is basically all higher-end gaming laptops from 2023 onwards. Again, like with the desktop ones, 8-core processors are probably going to perform very similarly to the 12-plus core ones, but I can't say for certain without more information. Finally, we have the recommended specs for graphics cards. This is listed as a 3060 Ti or a 6700 XT. The graphics cards that generally perform on par or just above these are the 2080 Ti, 3070, 4060 Ti, 5060, 6750 XT, 7700 XT, 9060 XT, and the Intel B580. The Intel card once again having the caveat that it may not perform as well as expected depending on the state of the software drivers when the game launches. I've tried to pick the lowest card from each recent graphics card generation that is at or above the recommended spec. All of the higher tier cards in each generation are of course going to be above the spec. Thanks for watching. I'll end with a reply from the game director of Europa Universalis V at Paradox Tento, who apparently uses or has used an Intel 11700K processor while developing and playtesting the game, 3 generations older than the recommended 14700K. This reinforces my expectation that any desktop processors 8-core plus from 2020 onwards are going to be completely fine running the game. When Paradox gets around to posting more granular requirements, I'll post a link to it in the comments, as that is likely to be more informative than my speculation. Hopefully some of you found this video useful. If you did, I always appreciate a like or subscribe. Adios y'all.